In the middle of a crisis event, communication is key. You need to know what to say, what not to say, and who needs to hear it, all while managing an emergency. Today, we'll learn key lessons on forming your message from some experts on the subject of effective crisis communications. I'm Russell Wooldridge, Senior Director of Business Development for DRI International, welcoming you to today's webinar on the new era in crisis communications. Joining us today to share their experiences are Suzanne Bernier, CBCP and President of SB Crisis Consulting, and instructor for our new Crisis Communications Workshop. Bob Jensen, Senior Managing Director, Strat 3 LLC. And Jessica Kindig, Exercise Program Manager for the Indiana State Department of Homeland Security. Let's start with Suzanne. Thanks for being with us today.
I'm Suzanne Bernier, and I'm really excited to talk to you today about something new coming from DRI in the fall. DRI has now introduced a new course on crisis communications and media relations. And I wanted to share a couple of items that are going to be included in the curriculum of the course, and a couple of things that I think are really timely right now for us to look at. So without further ado, I'm going to talk a bit and go into some slides, and we'll share a bit more about lessons learned and case studies on crisis communications. Now, I wanted to start off this presentation by talking a little bit about some of the new types of incidents that companies and communities are facing and have to really start planning for. I wanted to ask you who are listening today if you recognize what this image is. If you recognize the gentleman with the glasses that's in the foggy image in the back, and also if you recognize the gentleman in the circle. I'll tell you in a second who they are and explain to you why I wanted to talk a little bit about them. So now you might remember a couple of years ago on a United Airlines flight, a passenger was forcibly removed because another seat was, his seat, sorry, was assigned to an employee of the airline. And he did not want to move or leave, and this is what was shown. Of course, nowadays, it's really, we have to be cognizant of and aware that people have video cameras and can record and release that information or that video footage within the matter of seconds or minutes before even officials come by to respond. And so another thing that happened with this specific issue was because the current CEO at the time, who was the spokesperson as well for United, did not come with some empathetic comments at all until much later, and actually didn't even respond until much later at all. And it really did look bad on him as well as on United Airlines overall. And for 7 days, which is unheard of usually, but for 7 entire days, the media was focusing on, and this gentleman being dragged off the plane was the face of United Airlines for 7 days straight, which is unheard of. Now, it's just something to remind people that things like this could happen, and they can be exceptionally damaging, not only to the subject, but to the company responding or not responding appropriately. And here is the Oscar Munoz, the former United Airlines president and CEO. And this is what appeared in the coverage. Instead of being able for him to have a chance to take control of the message and create something positive from that negative situation, and letting people know of his sincerity and what they plan to do to make sure things like this would never happen again. But he didn't do that. And that was something that was missing. So let's go to And we're not going to go through all of this, but I just wanted to share a little bit about some of the basic rules on successfully communicating with the media. So a few different things, I'll just pick at them here. Don't give your personal opinion. I think that's pretty straightforward for most people, but you're talking on behalf of the company. If you're the spokesperson, not of course on behalf of yourself and your own opinions. Don't be intimidated. We've all seen this happen in some videos of images of reporters being a little bit upfront and personal, but don't be intimidated by that, and recognize and be aware that that might happen, and know how you're going to be able to respond and practice that ahead of time. Don't go off the record. Everybody knows that there's no off the record. That's a secret little, pause the record. Everything's on the record all the time. As long as you're talking to somebody and it's not just yourself, you're on the record. Avoid no comment. I think a lot of people now know this tip, but it really is important to avoid no comment, because as soon as anybody, the media or the public, hears someone say no comment, what they're hearing is, I'm guilty, or I'm hiding something. Avoid jargon. And that's why, let's say if you've got something where there's a lot of legalese or scientific terminology that's in there, make sure that you're communicating in a way that everybody, let's say from a 5th grade level and from English as a second language, would be able to understand what you're saying and the message that you're giving them. Of course, that's so important when you're giving critical crisis communications information to people. Be positive, not negative. Of course, you're going to be in negative situations, but talk about what you're doing positively to respond to it and to make sure it never happens again. And be brief. No one wants to hear you talk for 45 minutes to answer one question. And the media like the little short snippets that they can include as their cuts in their media coverage. Another thing that is fairly new within the last 10 years anyway, for emergency managers and business continuity planners, is the need to incorporate and remember to incorporate social media injects into our exercises, and even have social media exercises as well to test out how you're going to respond and recover from perhaps, let's say, damaging tweets that are coming through social media, or rumors and misinformation because of a crisis that you're involved in. And there may very well be, and we see this all the time, social media injects that are responding to real events and rumors and misinformation. Yes, unfortunately, with the advent of social media, we have to deal with that in some new, different ways, but we also now can respond just as quickly to the misinformation because we now also have access to social media to be able to communicate. I think it's a great, not substitution for, but a great addition to all of the other crisis communications and media relations tools that we have already. Now I just want to talk a little bit more about the pros and cons of social media. So a little bit about using social media in a crisis. A lot of people know that they should be using social media in a crisis now, including a lot of our official organizations and first response organizations as well. So a couple of things that I would want to just share with people is some tips on using social media in a crisis, if you don't already, is to have a social media strategy developed on when you're going to talk to the media, when you're not, when are you going to track social media, and when are you going to respond versus not respond and ignore, all of those things. Have trained reps or teams, social media and emergency management teams that are going to be ready and trained that you can pull in to be able to help with crisis communications through social media during the emergency. You can get outside help as well. There are different groups out there, volunteer groups that will help you in being able to get your social media messaging out during an emergency. And And monitor the online buzz minute by minute. If you're in the middle of a crisis already, it's really important for you to monitor, or somebody to monitor what's going on online, because guaranteed there's going to be stuff going on online if you've got a crisis and you have any kind of social media presence. Respond to any issues that might come up social media wise. And again, the issues with social media are a little bit different than they are with the regular media, but I think it's important for us to plan for and just recognize that. Provide evidence to do damage control. Remember that we could use social media to be able to do that as well, to provide evidence, take pictures, and then be able to send them back to headquarters or to the emergency operations center that can be used to provide evidence or damage control. Be transparent, keep friendly, and hopefully smile, not too much. Of course, when you're going through a situation where there may be fatalities, I don't recommend that you smile, but I do recommend that you have a tone of being friendly and understanding to your audience. Do not scream. That's another tip that we all give for social media, is doing the all caps is referred to as screaming or shouting and being rude in the social media world. So just a tip there. And remember to pitch at the level of the audience. So make sure that however you're writing, your tone of your text matches the audience that you're going to be responding to at the time. Okay, a couple of more items. Make sure that you're checking and double checking and triple checking all of your tweets that are officially going out by your organization, because we all know that once something's out, we can't bring it back and delete it. Well, we can delete it, but in the meantime, once it's out there, it could have been screenshot and shared around the world within the first minute before you've even thought that you wanted to delete something. So that's really important to remember that when we're communicating with people as well. Watch your fingers. It's so easy to slip, and instead of the T, you've got the R or something like that. So make sure, be aware of your spelling, not just your spelling. Here's a little incident happened a couple of years ago with Fema Region 4, and they sent out this very helpful tweet to let people know that Operation Blue Roof, a construction group that were helping people replace their damaged roofs and homes after Hurricane Irma. Well, Fema tweeted out the 1-800 number to be able to reach Operation Blue Roof. So 1-800-ROOF-BLUE, or the website. However, unfortunately, they kind of slipped, and it wasn't 1-800. It was 1-888-ROOF-BLUE that should have been the right number that was texted. Unfortunately, Fema realized after one of their followers tweeted back saying that he'd tried to call, and Roof Blue was an adult phone line. So a very different kind of hotline than they were expecting. And then he gave the correct number instead. So just a reminder to make sure that you double check and triple check, because it can happen to anybody, including Fema. And unfortunately, the next day, instead of having a nice headline saying Fema is helping connect people with Operation Blue Roof, instead, this is what came out instead as the headline. So I don't think you'd want to have that headline either if you could help it. And further to that, nowadays with technology, a reminder, don't put anything in an email. Remind your staff, don't put anything in an email or any other kind of electronic technology that you wouldn't or they wouldn't want to stand by if read at a press conference or published in a newspaper or broadcast on CNN tomorrow morning. So think about that. A couple of other things. A lot of people say, yeah, you know, social media is not great with crisis communications because they've been hacked. Yes, it's happened, and here you see one of the instances where that happened. And this was actually right after the Boston bombings happened. And the American press, their Twitter account was hacked. And shortly after the Boston bombings happened, the Twitter account for AP came out with a tweet saying the White House had been attacked and the president had been injured. And now, of course, none of us remember that. Do you remember? No one remembers that now, because American press did a really good job at being on it. And as soon as they recognized and realized that they were hacked, they were able to go and use another different account to be able to let everybody know, all of their followers know that, and then they tweeted this out instead, that they'd been hacked, and the tweet about the attack on the White House was false. So, I mean, this was a pretty major thing that happened at the time, but a few minutes later, AP caught it, was able to let people know it wasn't true, and no one remembers it all these few years later. So I think they did a pretty good job. We've got visual rumors now with social media as well. So they're being spread around to people. This specific rumor, visual rumor, so this is a picture. Apparently there was a lot of press that had included this picture after Hurricane Sandy in New York. And they'd have a caption underneath it saying, oh, this is a McDonald's in the, lower Manhattan after Hurricane Sandy. And then, this is a pretty cool looking picture, I guess, if you want to call that cool. But so this was spread and out to everybody and shared a lot through social media. Then it ends up that this wasn't a real McDonald's at all. It wasn't during Hurricane Sandy whatsoever. It was an art gallery exhibit that was done several years beforehand. So nothing to do with it, but easy to fall into that rumor by seeing something and believing something that someone wrote. This one as well this is a still of a movie several years ago. And people just felt that this would look good with Hurricane Sandy, and we're telling people that this happened during Hurricane Sandy, but it's a movie still. Some other things, annoying things with social media are the trend now of people wanting to take some cool selfies with some dangerous things in the background. So you see one here, but there's some, I've seen several of them. And the only thing I can say is to try to remind people safety before selfie, and your life is not worth a selfie accident, which we have seen in the past. And also, here's another thing that we see is people who think it's cool to go in front of an emergency or a disaster or a fire or an explosion or whatever it is and take their smiling pictures in front of it. So of course I would remind everybody to not do those kinds of things during an emergency situation. Now I'll just go into some spokesperson guidelines I wanted to share. This will be the last topic that we talk about today. So some spokesperson guidelines. I'm not going to go through all of these, but I talked about the no comment one already. And that one to me is the biggest one of any that I would recommend, is making sure that you're never saying no comment. You've got something to say. And if anything, it can be, I'm sorry, I don't have anything for you right now, but as soon as I do, or as soon as we do, or whatever it is, if you're forwarding them to a media person or whatever, as soon as we do, then we will get back to you. So that's still saying, that's saying no comment without saying no comment. You can always comment, which is like I just told, shared. Okay, so on-camera interview tips. Here's another thing that only within the last couple of years, and of course since the pandemic really, are we seeing a lot more requests for on-camera interviews, on virtual interviews. So a couple of different tips for those methods. Look at the interviewer, not the camera. So this is on-camera interview tips. If you're being If you're being interviewed by somebody, look at them as opposed to the camera that might be like over here, over their shoulder. And maintain eye contact throughout, if you can, and lean into the interview. So if you're sitting, just lean into the interview, not away from, because you can see how already that looks like I'm leaning into, I'm closer to you, and I'm sharing with you. And if I'm sitting back far away, it looks like I might be closed off. There's certain body language issues that we need to think about as well when we're dealing with the media, specifically online. So lean into the interview, not away from, sit up straight, breathe, and project your voice. And the more you sit up straight or even stand, which is better, the more you'll be able to project your voice if you are not able, if you have problems with that at all. And of course, show confidence, know that you're the one that knows what you're talking about. You've been trained in it, you know what you're talking about. And so show that, show confidence, and be human and real. It's not just about the company and the incident that happened. It's about all of the people that work for your company and all of the people that need to manage through it as well. Some common mistakes when dealing with the media, not responding to them quickly enough, having too many spokespeople. Most of the time we say, oh, I recommend at least 3 spokespeople that you have, which you should, yes. But then there's also the issue of potentially having too many spokespeople during a crisis. And then that might give way to an opportunity to have mixed messages somehow. So that's why it's really important as well to have just a limited amount of spokespeople with exactly what they're supposed to be saying and a list of their key messages to avoid the mixed messages from happening. Sometimes people don't have designated spokespersons, and that's unfortunate because unless you're trained as a media spokesperson, it's going to be very difficult to at least start with those with the difficult questions from media. Not countering rumors, and that is something that now with social media we just went through, that gives us an ability to be able to counter a lot of rumors in a very quick way, all the way around the world if we need to. Speculation and covering up or placing blame, well, I'm pretty sure that most of you would agree with that and know that already. But we've seen examples in the news of people who or who want to avoid responsibility, I guess, for a crisis, would feel it appropriate to, point to somebody else instead or place blame somewhere else. And you don't want to play the game, the blame game during a crisis or after a crisis. So make sure that you don't fall into that trap. Now, a couple of other things I wanted to talk about: fillers and how fillers can be killers. Now, you might not know what I'm talking about right now, but I will share with you in the next slide. So what are fillers? Well, there's filler sounds, like all those sounds that you say in between the words during your sentence. So your filler sounds, because you're trying to think of something, is like and then So those are the filler sounds. And what I would recommend and suggest is that you record yourself saying something and then review it afterwards, and then see how many times that you say any of those filler words and try to be aware of it. And then you'll naturally end up becoming more aware of those filler sounds and not doing them. So again, filler sounds, you'd rather have no sound and have silence for a few seconds instead of the or the because it really you can really tell when people are, and notice it when people are using those filler sounds. And usually people who use filler sounds use them all throughout their speech. So it'll be good to be aware of it if you're a speaker. Filler words, well, here's a whole list in front about some of those filler words. One that I have is a big pet peeve for me is the first one under filler words, again. And this one I think is one of the filler words that is said at the start of a sentence for most people every single day. But unfortunately, it's being misused by a lot of people. The only right way to say again is if you've already said something and now you're saying, you're repeating it again. So you're saying again, whatever you said before. But a lot of people just say again to start a sentence and they never said anything before. So that's not appropriate to say again. Anyway, that's just one of my little pet peeves. And then all the other filler words that we all know about. Okay, all right, like, literally. And then there are filler phrases. Did you know there are filler phrases? And those filler phrases are things like what you start with, I just think that, or to be honest, or what I'm trying to say is, or you know what I mean? These are all either things that are look or seem to and sound like you may be talking down to someone, or wanting to hide something from someone, because there are certain things like, to be honest. If someone starts a sentence with to be honest, automatically people think they're not honest or they're not being honest. No one needs to start something with to be honest if you're being honest. So we should be getting away from that completely anyway. And then of course it's more difficult when you're getting into the things like what I'm trying to say is, and you know what I mean, but you know what I mean. All right, let's go. Other things to avoid. So trying to use we, because you're talking about your organization or your community, not I. And of course, talking too fast or rambling, because then people may not be able to understand you if English is their second language, or if they operate at a, let's say, 5th grade level of understanding. Other things to avoid. So the media like short sound bites, as I had mentioned before, and video clips. They also hate having to edit, which is why they like the shorter clips. Don't give one-word answers though. And like I said, never say no comments or off the record. Don't interrupt your interviewer at all, and never talk down to your interviewer. All right, so this is just a little thing that we should be going through before an interview and then during interview. And it's really just basics. Know what you're getting into ahead of time, find out what the publication of the program is, decide on what your goals are for the interview, not theirs, what your goals are for the interview. And then think about what you want to say, prepare your messages, and remember that you're the expert. Draw confidence from that. And then during the interview, some of the things that we had mentioned, using short, direct answers, bridge to get your point across when you can, anytime you can. Talk solutions instead of problems, right? The positive side as opposed to the negative side. Speak clearly, all of the stuff that we talked about. All right. Some media traps and how to avoid them. Media trap number 1, cameras are always on and microphones are always hot. Some of us saw recently some people who were caught on hot mics, saying certain things that they wouldn't have wanted to be public. Media interview trap number 2, going off message or just reacting or overreacting to the journalist's questions. Media interview trap number 3, going off the record, or them telling you, okay, well, off the record, remember there's no off the record. And media interview trap number 4 is repeating negative words or sentences that the interviewer is using because they want you to hear you repeat those negative words or that negative comment, because that makes a great video shot or soundbite afterwards. All right, some more on how to handle a video interview. I think we've talked about some of this already, but everybody's used to Zoom these days, so check your tech. Have a plan if things go wrong, because with technology, we know they do. And dress the part. And I know these days with Zoom, people are like in their PJs or their PJ pants with their suit. But you want to dress the part when you're speaking on interview, even if you're at home. So make sure that you're actually, yeah. And let's see, let's go to the next area. Mind your body language. And we talked about that before, sitting in front versus in back, and not to rely on notes, because of course you're in a video interview, so they can see you. And try to make as great a first impression as you can. Try to smile before, during, and after the interview, and say thank you. Now, a couple of other things on preparing for virtual interviews. For this one, you're looking at the camera. So remember before we talked about when you're being interviewed one-on-one with a reporter, then you're looking at the reporter, not the camera. This time though, with a virtual interview that you're doing online, you're actually looking at the camera. As opposed to, let's say if you're looking at the interviewer, you want to look at the camera part instead, and that'll give the appearance that you're looking and speaking at the public. Maintain an erect posture, like we had mentioned, and prepare. Even though you think that it might be more casual because we're all working from home now, let's act like for this interview that you're working in the office and you're meeting them one-on-one, even if you're not. Prepare for tough questions. That's a no-brainer. Measure your results afterwards. Did you get some good press and some good media afterwards? All right. And I think that brings us to the end of what I wanted to talk about today. And the other thing I wanted to note actually is I have a friend and colleague of mine who just recently sent me this book called The Public Speaking Bible, a survival guide for standing on stage. So I was thinking that maybe, wouldn't it be cool if I give out this public speaking Bible to one winner who attends our first in-person DRI crisis communications course. So I'm not going to give away any of the tidbits in it or anything, but this is just a friend of mine from the UK who's a professional speaker and sent me a couple of copies. So I'll read through it, and I hope one winner will as well. All right. Thank you to everyone. Enjoy the rest of your summer, and we will see you safe and sound in the fall.
My name is Bob Jensen. I'm Senior Managing Director for Strat3, and I'm really happy to be a part of this webinar series. It's great to know that my good friend Suzanne Bernier and also her friend Jessica will be also on this webinar. They're two fantastic communicators, so I think you're going to get a lot out of it. I'm going to talk about maybe a little bit different aspect of crisis communication. I'm going to look at it from a systems viewpoint, and so this is a little bit different than looking at the messaging, looking at how do you write a crisis communication plan. I'm sure that Suzanne will cover that in an exquisite form. So let's go ahead and start my presentation. Okay, so the title of my short presentation is 5 Keys to Success for Crisis Communication. And I'm going to, as I said just a second ago, I'm going to be looking at the system side of things. And because that's what I've found in my 40 years of doing this, that many people focus only on the plan, or they focus completely on the messaging, but they don't think about what it takes to actually implement or execute these crisis communication plans. We'll go to the next slide. So here are the 5 keys. So if you go to sleep after this, but you remember this, then you're going to probably do okay. So here's the 5 keys. The first one is use a systems approach, and I'm going to get into that a little bit more. The second one is you need to know your risk and threats. So many times when I talk to companies or to government organizations, they work real hard to come up with a crisis communication plan, but they don't really know what their risks and threats are, and that's really important. So I'm going to talk about that as well. And next, you have to understand your audiences. Too many times, all of these crisis communication plans, they just assume everybody's the same, and that's not quite the case, and we'll talk more about that. I can't emphasize enough about train, and train some more. And finally, you need to have a backup plan, and I'll give you some ideas about that. Let's go ahead and go to the next slide. So when I say systems approach, I always talk about the system that it takes to actually execute a crisis communication plan, right? And the system is actually more important than the plan. You can have a really great plan, but if the system doesn't work, then it doesn't matter, because the effectiveness of that plan is going to be really diminished by a poor system. Many times I've seen really strong systems have taken poor plans and kind of boosted them and made them a little bit better. So the system, it includes things like all the processes that help you execute that plan. For example, how do you distribute information? What is the system for developing information, getting it reviewed, and getting it cleared for release? What is your system for reaching out to all your different stakeholders? So all of those processes, are part of your system. The system also includes things like having a clear trigger mechanism. Now, this is super important. We always talk about crisis and crisis management. One of the things I always see missing, or many times see missing in crisis management plans, is what is the trigger? How do you know that it's a crisis? What are the characteristics? At what point, do you say, oh, this is a crisis, we now have to, activate our crisis management plan, right? That should really be very clear, right? And everyone should know what those are. Finally, you have to have some really strong relationships and team dynamics. So the team dynamics, obviously, is not just you and your communication team, it's you and the rest of the organization. It's you and your team with partner organizations, with stakeholder groups. There needs to be very, very strong relationships there, because if you don't have those relationships, you're not going to get the information you need, or you're not going to be able to reach out and engage with stakeholders in a timely and meaningful way, right? So you need to really work on those, and that's all part of the system. Finally, the equipment and technology. We can't do anything today without technology, or so they say, but the reality is that many times technology isn't there, which is why number 6, you have to have a backup to the full system, right? So if the power goes out, or you lose connectivity to the internet, or the cell towers are knocked down. I was in Haiti right after the 2010 massive earthquake down there. There's no power. All the cell towers are down. TV and radio stations were out. We had to figure out how to get information, to the people as we were working with the international community to bring in aid and help people survive, right? And so that was a big thing for us to have backups to a normal situation, because during crisis, many times it's coinciding with a disaster like a massive tornado or massive flooding. So you may not always have the systems and technology in place, and you need to know what to do with that. Let's go to the next slide. Again, I talked a little bit about knowing your risks and threats, right? Many times people have a poor understanding of risk and threat. So if you don't know what those are, you really need to learn more about how do you identify risk and threat, because you can't prepare a very strong crisis communication plan if you don't know what you're preparing and responding to, right? I always advocate to my clients to use a 360-degree approach to assessing risk and threats. This means looking at what are your internal, and this is mostly what most risk management does, is looks at the internal risks and threats. What happens if a machine goes down? What happens if X, Y, or Z happens inside the company? But I say, okay, now you need to look at the external threats as well. what happens if your suppliers can't get you the supplies you need? Or what happens if something from your suppliers causes a problem in your product? Here's an example of that. When I was at FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, we had these meals ready to eat that we would give out after a disaster to people who needed food, just for a couple of days while they were trying to find a new place to live. And one of the products in one of those kits was some peanut butter. Now, peanut butter, you don't really think that's going to be a big deal. But we got information from the supplier that, oh, they were told by their supplier that peanut butter that there's a possibility it might be contaminated with salmonella. Now, suddenly, it's our problem, and we really needed to figure out how to deal with that. So again, that's an example how an external threat or risk becomes yours. Of course, digital, right now, besides COVID, the number one threat to our national security and our national economy is cyber attacks. And that's happening on a daily basis. It's getting worse. You're reading about it in the newspaper. If you're not ready to talk about those, and especially data leaks and when people lose their personal information because of your company or your organization, you're really going to need to be able to figure out how to talk about that. Reputational issues with social media. This happens on a regular basis, and you need to be able to deal with that as well. Most companies I talk to say, oh, we have a business continuity plan, and that's great. But when you're talking about reputational risk, there's no business process to fix or replace, right? It's something completely outside of that. And then you want to think about future risks and threats. So, for example, NASA just put out a report that said by 2030, all the areas along the coastline of the U.S. are going to have much worse flooding because of higher tides. And this is going to be a big deal. And so people need to, and anyone living along there needs to include that in their risk and threat assessments. When you're looking at your messaging, you should have messaging for each one of the major risks and threats. Obviously, you can't have messaging for every single thing that could possibly happen, but you should have messaging for the ones that are most likely to happen, and or the ones that if they do happen are going to have the greatest negative impact. So your messaging should include facts about the situation and about your organization, about what you're doing. It should have what is the organization's position, right? What are you doing? How are you going to fix it? How are you going to prevent it from happening in the future? And this is the area that many times organizations forget. You need to answer what the public's concerns are, right? Many times messaging just looks at how do we position ourselves to make sure we don't get a lawsuit. But the reality is you probably would have better trust and confidence from the public if you answer what their questions are and what they're concerned about. So, for example, if there is a chemical leak, people want to know, oh, is that poisonous? Is it going to affect my health? What do I need to do to stay safe? These are the types of things that you want to include in there. And finally, you need to be able to ID emerging threats. What was sad is that we knew that something like the COVID pandemic was going to happen. We just didn't know when. And both the government, not just our government, all governments, and even the World Health Organization, they're a little slow in saying this is going to be a major problem, right? And so that's just an example of where we really need to be able to have a better job, a better way of identifying emerging threats, right? And so that should be part of your risk and threat assessments. Next slide, please. Understanding your audiences. Communication is all about your audiences, right? And now, number one thing I tell people is you don't have just one audience, you have many audiences, right? And the way we are right now in the United States, everybody's getting their information in a different way. Oh, and not only is traditional media losing its impact and losing its viewership, new media is coming in and it's changing regularly, right? And so how people get their information is changing rapidly, and you need to know how your different audiences get their information. You also need to know, besides how they get their information, you need to have a pretty good idea of what do they want to know. So, they don't need to know that you're very concerned about the public. Of course, they're going to assume that you know that, but they want to know what should they do. They want to know, what it is you're going to do to fix the problem, right? So that's a big thing when you're developing your messaging for your crisis communication plans. Always think about your audiences. Be sure to include the fact that in today's America, almost every city is multilingual and multicultural. And you need to think about, how do you do that? Do you put everything out in just English? Do you have the ability to put things out in Spanish? Maybe you're in a city that has some other major languages that are used. You need to think about, is it appropriate for you to be able to put things out in those languages, or to work with community leaders to ask them to translate things for you. Multicultural is also very important. So for example, when I was with FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, dealing with Hurricane Sandy up in New York City, we made sure that when we reached out to different community groups, that we were very mindful of the culture. So for example, we had halal food, we had kosher food. When we had people going around to communities, we made sure, if we knew the community was a majority Muslim community, that we had 2 women who would go and knock on the door, because if it was only the wife was at home, she's not going to open the door for a couple of guys. Well, that probably is true for many other cultures as well, but that's just kind of an example of where you have to think about what are cultural expectations and norms, and how do you take that into account when you're communicating. The next thing, establish relationships early. The worst time to start to try and establish relationship with different communities or stakeholders is when the disaster is happening. People are usually pretty busy then. So what you want to do is figure out, who are your key communities and your key stakeholders, and you should be working on establishing relationships early. Find out who the leaders are. Many times the leaders, are not necessarily elected leaders. They might be informal leaders. You need to know who they are. And also, very, very important, number 6, have feedback channels, right? You need to know if your communication is hitting the mark. You need to know if there are other things that are happening, emerging threats or emerging issues. You need to know if people are happy with what you're saying and how your organization is responding, or if it's not hitting the mark. And this is all part of the feedback channels that you need to have to make sure that what you're doing is exactly right and having the effect you want. Next slide. Train, 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 train. I'll just keep saying train. And the reason is too many times, and I saw this when I worked for the US government, and I see it with clients that I deal with now, where when I come in and say, hey, can I see your crisis communication plan, or can I see your crisis management plan? Well, they usually take 5 or 10 minutes to try and find it. They pull it off a shelf and they blow the dust off it. And I tell them, I say, well, I'm not going to ask the next 2 questions. And that is, did you train to this plan, and have you exercised the plan? Too many times, everyone thinks that the end all be all is to have a plan. So they work really hard and they have this plan. Then when they're done with the plan, they're like, okay, that's done. We did that, tick the box. They put it up on a shelf and they never look at it again. But the problem is, if you don't train to that plan, you're not going to really be able to do things very well. And number 1, though, train your plan to the system. What is the system that you have that's going to make that plan work? And then train the rest of the organization to the plan, so everybody kind of knows what it is you're doing. So when your communication team is going to the operational team and telling them, hey, we need this information so we can put some information out, that they'll know what it is you're doing and why you're asking. Ensure your leadership is trained. This is one of the most important things, is if your leadership doesn't know what you're doing, and they don't know what the plan is, and they don't know what their role is, you're not going to do very well. So make sure your leadership is also trained. Train with your partner organizations. Your organization is not going to be an island into itself when there's a crisis. You're going to be dealing with other organizations, and you need to have them helping you. So this is a thing that you let them in and you train with them so they know how you're going to react when a crisis happens. And then exercising the plan. This is super important. You bring in, you can create an exercise on your own, or you can bring a company in to develop an exercise for you. And the goal of the exercise is not to pass with flying colors. That's not really the whole point of doing an exercise. The exercise is to identify issues. It's to identify, where are your weak points? Are there any gaps in the plan? Are there capabilities that are missing? Are there partnerships that aren't working well? You want to identify all of those during an exercise so that you can fix them, right? And you need to fix them before you actually have a crisis. So again, that's the main purpose of doing an exercise. So that you find out, okay, we've been training and training and training. Are we really ready? And that's how you know. And finally, again, as I said, you need to fix those gaps and weaknesses. Too many times people do an exercise, they do an after action report. They said, oh, we've identified lessons learned, but they never fix anything. So there really should just be lessons identified because they're not learned until you fix the plan, you close the gap, and you fix the capability. Next slide, please. And finally, have a backup plan, right? And by backup plan, I mean, for example, you need to check all your equipment and your processes on a regular basis. Are they working? Are there any issues? I can't tell you how many times a crisis happens and people realize, oh, we didn't renew that license, or our equipment just went down and we don't have something to replace it, or we don't have backup, right? And that's something you really need to have figured out, because you can't get things done as quick as you need it if there is a crisis. Also, do you have a COOP site? And COOP is continuity of operations. Now, some organizations like the U.S. government, they have whole, big facilities that are, like outside of Washington, D.C., they have a facility for the U.S. government that's supposedly super secret, but it's on every Google map. In any case, it's where the government can go, or where your organization can go if something happens to your main business site. So maybe there's a big fire, or maybe there's a flood and it shuts off that site location. Maybe all the power goes out and you need to go somewhere else. So this is something you need to think about. It can be something where you say, hey, we're going to go down to one of the shared work site companies and just rent some space, or we'll go to a hotel. I know organizations that rent ballrooms and hotels just to temporarily for a day or two, get their business going. And then if you're going to do that, you need to say, well, what are we going to take there, and how do we connect, and how do we get everything going very quickly? So that's what a COOP site is, and you need to be thinking about how to do that. Could be that you're working from home. This is something we're finding with COVID, that more and more companies are able to have their staff work from home, and that might be a COOP plan. The fourth thing is being able to go old school if needed. So for example, when you're in a big disaster zone, there's no power. Many people have been forced out of their homes, so they're not watching TV for the news. They're not getting their newspaper. How do you get information to them? I know that in many disasters, we would actually print out flyers and go to shelters and go to hotels and put information up on, on the notice boards that they had there. And that's pretty old school. Or we'd have town halls where we would go and meet with a big group of people and just talk to them and let them know what's going on. Obviously, we, whenever we could, we try and get information directly to people through their smartphones. But if all the cell towers are down, for example, you're not going to be able to do that. So you need to be able to get information out, and you should be thinking about that. What if the power's out? What if the internet goes down? What if we don't have the ability to connect with people in the normal way we do using technology? How do we do it? I faced that when I was in Haiti after the major earthquake there, and so we figured out some ways to get around that. And finally, you should have a surge force plan. And surge force, what that means is the bigger the crisis and the longer it's going to go, you're going to need some help. Maybe you have people from another part of your organization that can come in and help you. Maybe you hire in a PR team, or maybe you bring in people from an association. Whatever you need to do, you need to figure out, how do you give your team a little bit of a break? Because people can't do 24/7 for very long. It's just not possible. And if you do, then there's going to be a lot more mistakes that are happening, and that's not something you want either. So figure out, where will you get extra help if you need it? And that's something that many organizations they just never think of that. And I think it's really important for you to know. So next slide, please. So here's my email address, and you can also follow me on Twitter. I talk about crisis management, risk management, and crisis communication, among other things on Twitter. Feel free to email me. I've got, I can send you these slides. I've got articles and other presentations on crisis communication that I'm happy to share with you. Just remind me that you're asking because of this webinar. And I'm really happy to be partnering with DRI. And I'm really glad that you also get to see my good friend Suzanne and Jessica as well. So thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate it.
Hi, hello, greetings from Indiana. My name is Jess Kindig, and I began my career in public safety in 2010 as an intern with the City of Indianapolis Department of Public Safety. Following my internship, I made the move to the criminal justice side as an animal cruelty investigator. While there, I received my master's in criminal justice and public safety. And through that, I've had the pleasure of teaching undergraduate criminal justice courses before starting my career in exercise planning and training. After a handful of years in the private sector, I am now currently with the state of Indiana Department of Homeland Security as the exercise program manager. Today, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the state of Indiana and crisis communications and real world incidents, what we did great, what we learned, how to improve, how to test those policies and procedures. And then at the end, we'll kind of talk about how the state's leaning forward in identifying future threats and sustaining communications. I'm super excited, so let's get started. So before we get too down in the weeds here, I wanted to first discuss Indiana's definition of crisis communications, because that can be a little different across the emergency management realm. So when we're talking crisis communications for this discussion, I'm taking the perspective for our Emergency Operations Center, or our EOC. Every EOC is different, but for Indiana, the EOC functions as a central coordination center for public matter experts and key organization personnel who facilitate an effective, direct, coordinated response to the needs of the citizens of Indiana in the event of a natural disaster or a significant event. So our crisis communications and those interoperational systems are somewhat twofold, because we rely heavily on our emergency support function too, which is communications, to ensure that the communications are sustained to tactical teams, incident command posts, government officials, multi-jurisdictional agencies, and multidisciplinary emergency responders. But we also, on the other side, rely heavily on ESF 15, which is our emergency support function for external affairs and public information to communicate to the public during an emergency. So that's twofold for us. Our definition also encapsulates voice communication and data communication, because much of our responsibility is resource support and information sharing, including intelligence collected from other state agencies. For instance, our fusion center, our state police, the FBI, depending on the complexity of the incident. So we must maintain this flow of all the way to the boots on the ground tactical level, and from that level all the way up to the EOC. So with that in mind, this is kind of what we're going to talk about real briefly. We're going to dive into the after action report. So the good, the bad, and the uh-oh. So we are going to start out with the good. I'm going to take us all the way back to 2007 when we had Operation Blizzard Blast was a snow emergency that kind of, we knew it was coming, but didn't know how quick or how hard it was going to hit. So on February 12th, 2007, Indiana was impacted with heavy snow, ice, and high winds, creating a very dangerous situation on the home fronts, but also along the roadways and everywhere in between. We experienced widespread power outages, stranded motorists, numerous accidents, many individuals and families needing shelter. In preparation for this, IDHS, so Indiana Department of Homeland Security, held conference calls with the National Weather Service and all of our 92 counties, as well as utility companies and news media. Our EOC was activated at 1800 hours, was staffed 24/7 to provide assistance and support to local jurisdictions and state response personnel. The EOC remained open for 70 hours, and we closed at 1600 hours on February 15th, 2007. The key findings in this for communications we found was ESF2, prior to this incident, was tasked with constructing and maintaining a new statewide radio system. They were not completed with this process yet, with having 112 of the 127 radio system sites being operational, with the remaining sites expected to be completed by summer of that year. The good thing is, one of the great things we found was all but one of those communication sites remained operational during the event. So that was a good thing that happened with us. Another key finding was a commercial telecommunications concentrator linking one of the above that we talked about sites to a master site failed during the incident. So that was the one that went down. So in preparation for such a failure, the site was able to be forced to a feeder site via site trunking, which is a fallback condition when a site has lost its normal connectivity. So sites in this condition are able to operate in a normal trunked mode and rely on repeaters to transmit radio signals to expand coverage and therefore get information out to greater distances. So ultimately, it's a computer-controlled network that automatically connects users to available radio channels when needed. So one site goes down, it'll transfer you over to another channel. So me, if I was in the field, I don't lose communication with my command or with my partners. It's done without me even knowing it to allow for that stability during the incident. So another pat on the back was in 2016, we experienced an avian influenza. So the AH5N8, highly pathogenic avian influenza, was confirmed present in a commercial turkey farm here in Dubois County, Indiana. Keeping in mind that at the time, Indiana was among the top 5 states that provide poultry to the United States. In 2020, we were actually number 2. So patient 0, which was a turkey, was identified on January 15th, 2016. But what was crazy about this was the following day, the virus was detected in 9 additional commercial turkey farms, with 2 more turkey farms in the dangerous contact proximity zone because of how close they are to other infected properties. So on June 15th, then, 2016, Indiana, we activated our state EOC. The ESF support we had on this response was ESF1, which is transportation, 5 was emergency management, 8 was public health and medical, 10 oil and hazardous waste, 11 food, agriculture, and natural resources, and finally ESF 13, which is our law enforcement. A lot of agencies just right there working on this incident. The Indiana State Board of Animal Health was the lead state agency for this response, and the Indiana State Department of Health provided the public health and medical services support, while Dubois County Health Department led the local response, including monitoring for exposed county residents. And they were working in cooperation with Memorial Hospital in Jasper, Indiana. The state incident management team was deployed to Dubois County to establish a unified command post in conjunction with the United States Department of Agriculture. The state health department deployed a field liaison to the unified command post to communicate with other state and local agencies. ISDH, the Department of Health, State Department of Health, supported several missions from the state EOC, including distribution of N95 respirators and laboratory testing supplies, as well as the placement of antiviral medication at the local hospital. There were multiple hot zones. Those hot zones were quickly increasing, thus causing increasing response complexity, and the requirement for stable communications was equally increasing. And what we found was, because of all the stability with our communications, we had everyone, as you can tell, from the local level all the way up to the federal level. So there was an active and cooperative unified command, and that is key to a lot of some of these complex response activities. Having that good situational assessment with boots on the ground, we're going into these farms, we're doing what we need to do there, all the way up to the state EOC, and then the state EOC can help report to our federal partners. Daily coordination, it was it's still used as an example of how communications works very well, from incident management teams to district task forces. It was very much so key in how well that response, how well it went. And I wouldn't be talking response if I wasn't talking about COVID-19, right? So in many ways, COVID-19 was a record breaker for IDHS. To give a little bit of our state's perspective here, I'm going to give a summary of some of our statistics. These are way, way, way preliminary. We only just now went to normal operations, and I'll talk about that in a second. So we activated to a level 1 for the first time in state EOC's history. And the history I recently learned goes back to the early 1970s. I think they said it was 1972. So it was the very first time we've ever been a level 1. On March 4th, we activated the state EOC in response to the COVID-19 pandemic, and almost immediately went up to that level 1. After 101 operational periods, on June 12th, we decreased our activation level to a level 3. We maintained this posture until returning to normal operations on June 30th, 2021. So just about a month ago. And just to let everyone know, a level 1 in our state means that the governor is kind of the incident commander. He's the one that's calling the shots, giving us the objectives, and then we're the ones supporting his plan and what he wants us to, hopefully, how to combat COVID-19. And our first confirmed case of COVID-19 was on March 6th, 2020. So we received over 1,200 missions from counties across the state. We are still working on some, but we have completed just under 1,216. We had 1,240 requested of us. We delivered 4,290,944 pieces of PPE, personal protective equipment, to public safety and first responder staff. We traveled, and distributing that PPE, we traveled just under 16,000 miles in a 3-month period. And we assisted the Indiana Department of Health with vaccine distribution, and we were able to distribute 81,254 doses of the vaccine among the state. So more to come on that. Like I said, we just stopped. We're now taking a breath, but we will be collecting some more data, and we'll complete the after action process. I am a part of that team, so I will aid in the development of that report and the distribution of it. But I will say that some of the key findings I know from when I was sitting in there, and some of our thoughts along the way, was our Joint Information Center, what we call a JIC, was made up of emergency management folks and public health folks. And it was highly effective in communicating to the public on guidelines for sheltering in place, as were orders in the beginning of this whole thing, as well as testing and vaccine site information and public assistance to our stakeholders. So that was highly effective. We also had some secondary incidents to respond to while responding to the primary incident of COVID, including, there was some civil unrest, and it was a rough summer for my state. And there were a time or two where our disruption of our communications was a concern. So to mitigate this, we relied heavily on that ESF2, our communications emergency support function, who were able to acquire and set up a FirstNet Nighthawk secured system. It's essentially a mobile hotspot on steroids, right? It's developed specifically for public safety responders, uber secure, uber hard to crack and get through. And luckily we didn't have an issue with communications really at all during this whole COVID adventure, I guess. So ESF2 will be forever critical in developing and maintaining our communications channels. So that is the round of applause, pat on the back. We did great, go us. Adjusted some policies because of what worked so well. But with the good comes the shoulda, coulda, woulda, hard part of what we do in emergency management, of identifying what we can do better. Because in the following examples, failure meant lives lost, redundancy of effort, and that is the antithesis of what we're trying to do here. So I'm going to take you to 2011. There was a structural collapse that took the lives of 7 individuals and injured numerous others at the Indiana State Fair on August 13th, 2011. And that is what we're going to use to kick off on the somber opportunity to look at our response capabilities, determine ways to improve those capabilities through this after action process. This was a mass casualty incident. It comprised of 1 5-hour operational period, and crisis communications, specifically interagency and interoperable communications, were identified as the primary area for improvement. I'm not going to get too in the weeds here with acronyms and specific types, but there were 3 separate and distinct communications pipelines being used during this incident. One was the Indiana State Fairgrounds Communications Network. That was used by state fair personnel only. The state 800 trunk system that I talked about previously, Indiana State Police and state agencies were using that channel of communication. And then there was another that was the public safety channel that included local response, local public safety response. So that was 3. And it turns out that the cellular telephone pipeline was really the only communications method that all incident responders knew that they had in common. When the cellular communications option was lost, the only effective interoperability between those systems was direct face-to-face verbal interaction because of the overloaded cellular telephone network. Of significant note, the lack of interoperable communications between the Indiana Metropolitan Police Department, the Indiana State Police, the Indianapolis Fire Department, and the Indiana Emergency Medical Services was a significant hindrance to response operations. So the recommendation out of that was a multi-agency communications plan should be developed and disseminated prior to any event. All agencies which have or may have a response role in a special event venue should have radios programmed for pre-designed special event channels or access to radios with special events channels pre-programmed. All interoperable communications should be tested prior to the start of the event, and dispatching agencies should have protocols developed to switch responding units to the pre-designated channels upon dispatching them. And I will be happy to say we have that now. We have that now. So moving on, a year later in 2012, there's a picture of it on the PowerPoint, which kind of doesn't really do it justice. On March 2nd, 2012, at approximately 3:09 p.m., tornadoes, yes, tornadoes, 2 struck Clark County, which is a tiny little county in Indiana. It's not even 400 miles. It's a lot of rural and farmland. Was hit by an F3 tornado. That path was 17 miles across the county and just about half a mile wide. The tornado then intensified to an EF4 with 175 mile per hour estimated winds. At that strength, the tornado then struck the south buildings of the Henryville Middle School and High School complex with severe damage, along with many more houses and businesses. Following the tornado, damage assessments discovered extensive ground scoring in farmers' fields, and scoring was evidence of a multi-vortex tornado that separated into 2 tornadoes, and those 2 tornadoes went along parallel to each other for a little bit, and then that second one returned back to the main vortex. So the key findings with communications there, one was the JIC, as I talked about earlier, the Joint Information Center, and the EOC coordination. So this ultimately was great. And so when I read through this, you're gonna be like, this was just fine. But there are a few things that we could have done better that we do now as a normal response function. So the communication efforts between the EOC and the JIC were highly effective. In the first couple of days, the JIC was able to have high reliability on the information posted in WebEOC, which is an online information sharing resource that we use within the state of Indiana and to our locals. So the JIC has access to that. They could see what was going on and they could report out based on that. The EOC staff seemed to do a good job with vetting and analyzing and posting a significant amount of high quality updated information. So something else that they did was they relocated a JIC to Indianapolis, which was remote from the disaster, but in close proximity to the EOC. And that seemed to work very well too. There were field PIOs that would then report back. And all of that was the first time it was tested, and it seemed to work very well. The role of the JIC was shown to be distinctly necessary in an effective crisis communication effort. So given that, here's some things that we found we needed to do better next time, and we do them now. So the first one was that the JIC should be added to the executive summary distribution list, and that's all gobbledygook for every so often in every response, the planning section or somebody in the EOC will write an executive summary that updates everyone on what's going on. And for some reason, the JIC wasn't on that distribution list. Well, they are now. I can tell you that. They are now. Something else they found was the emergency support functions couldn't see the press release board on WebEOC. They are now given access to that. Sometimes our ESFs are sitting outside of the state EOC, and that was probably part of that issue there. It was just an access, security access. And then it was EOC needs to update the emergency support function call list for sure, and pre-printed organizational charts of the JIC, of the EOC, of field PIO positions, where would they go, would help clarify lingering confusion about who does what from where. Where we really find some major communication problems was somewhat internal. So it was the communications to the incident management assistance team members. Communications to the IMAP members were via email, and they were ineffective and overwhelmed team members. Email communications from the state EOC to IMAP members were not received because email systems were inoperable in the early stages of the incident, and the state EOC didn't know that at the time. So vital information was not received by IMAP members from the EOC during the most critical time, which is the first several hours of the incident. The EOC relies heavily on email communication. So not knowing that they weren't receiving that information was a critical error. So the IMAT members did not receive their email messages, and so they didn't know the magnitude of the events. IMAT members were overwhelmed with large volumes of emails from the state EOC, and their emails included regular emails as well as messages from other information seekers. So the deluge of emails prevented IMAT members from effectively receiving and reading all their emails, which led to a great deal of misinformation. So the recommendation for that was that the state EOC should ensure that all critical information sent to IMAT members is communicated on scheduled conference calls, or that the IMAT branch director should be assigned the task of ensuring critical communications are delivered with confirmed receipt of the intended IMAT members. And finally, with this one, holy cow, oh my gosh, just wait till you guys hear this. So the IMAT experienced significant difficulties with the alert and notification of team members, which resulted from the absence of an established common procedure or supporting infrastructure to support this capability. As a result of this deficiency, team members did not receive clear information regarding time of deployment, location of deployment, location of other team members, what equipment was required for deployment, the deployment destination for team members, or an appropriate route to travel to get to the deployment location. Holy cow. So the analysis of this observation, the team had knowledge of this deficiency prior to this deployment and had begun to develop a resolution to the challenge of the team alert process. At the commencement of this incident, corrective action had not been completed. So the alternative strategy employed was to use an email system. When the team activated, the individual responsible for team activation at the state EOC, and hear me out here, was also the IMAT's team incident commander. So holy cow, right? This individual was simultaneously filling the role of the operations section chief at the state EOC. And within a short period of time, this individual was also tasked with being on the advanced team deployed by helicopter to Henryville. So serving in all these capabilities simultaneously limited his ability to effectively communicate with the team about the incident situation and other pertinent information. In addition, by fulfilling several roles, the IMAT incident commander was unable to effectively communicate to team members about who was to travel to Henryville via helicopter, who needed travel to the disaster area within the team convoy, and how to get there. Team members who were staged and completed mission preparation at the logistical facility did not receive critical information about mission assignment and the incident situation. So holy cow, recommendation 1, when the IMAT is alerted, establish a radio talk group for all team members to utilize for critical information sharing and mission direction. Check mark, we 100% do that now. Recommendation 2, complete the current process of including all team members on the existing system in order to facilitate an effective alerting process. We do have that process set in place. And recommendation 3 is develop an alert and dispatch SOP, standard operating procedure, for the team to follow when activated. And that is done and it's continuously updated. So a final thought on this incident, it is now policy that an IDHS employee is either an IMAT rostered resource or a state EOC resource, not both. So for instance, my section chief is rostered on the state IMAT team and is a deployable resource to anywhere in the US. And I am rostered as a resource in the state EOC. So I am deployable to the state. If we are both deployed, I am here in Indiana in the EOC, and she goes elsewhere. So there is no more of this filling a seat in the EOC and while being deployed elsewhere. Okay. So it's never fun, you know, to look at what we did wrong, but it's important because we make changes, we get better, we save lives, we analyze our gaps, we improve our response methodology next time around. So we take what we've learned and do what? Well, we do some planning, training, and exercising. So the first thing is the planning. We do PACE planning. So it was originally developed by the U.S. Army. It's a framework to ensure continuity of communications. PACE stands for Primary, Alternate, Contingency, and Emergency. It designates the order in which an element will move through communication systems until contact can be established. So with our trunk system, it does it kind of automatically. And things like that. It streamlines messaging to our responders and stakeholders, i.e. the public, shelter in place or evacuate. It avoids confusion, mitigates that redundancy of effort that we try very hard to stay away from, promotes the trust of emergency management along responders and to stakeholders. Who will be handling internal and external communications? This person will know their role before a crisis happens, and this person can pull together the key stakeholders quickly. They will help create a list, share this list of contacts with key stakeholders, a list of communications channels, so maybe a company website, social media site, things of that nature in the state level, your logins for your specific seat that you're sitting in. It'll help communicate with others and have all of that up front and ready to go. And the PACE planning, who needs to be informed? Your internal staff, short but sweet messaging, right? We'll update as soon, we know there's a problem, we'll update as soon as we can. Well, a lot of times that's the same thing with external. When we are talking with the media or talking directly to stakeholders, a short statement acknowledging the situation, we're aware, things are fluid, we'll communicate any changes as they come. If it's something that's a little bit scary, like might be seen as a terrorist attack, but we don't know, you know, we'll say we're investigating, we'll let you know, and things like that. Or it can come on a predetermined briefing schedule. And we saw that recently with the state of Florida and their public briefings on recovery efforts, search and rescue efforts at the Surfside building collapse. So we've got our plan, and then we have to test our plan, break our plan, learn from our plan, and move on. And so in the state, we do the integrated preparedness plan. This plan is a document, takes all the organizations that we have, not just the state, but agencies in the state, our federal partners, local, nonprofit, and private sectors, and what threats and hazards they have, what keeps them up at night. We list them all out. We talk about ranking them. What do we want to exercise? What do we want to train on and get better with this? It identifies some preparedness activities to help that organization build upon and sustain capabilities needed to address those preparedness priorities. It should lay out, and it does lay out, a jurisdictional threat, an organization's threat, hazard, and risk along internal and external factors. We do this for multi-years. So for instance, based on this process, the state of Indiana will be focusing on a long-term communications outage. That's going to be an exercise series in 2024 to 2026. This hazard continues to appear in many areas of improvement and exercises, but it was also identified as a top threat that has never been tested. So we're gonna test that out coming up in 2024. In the meantime, right now we're working on a logistical staging area. Following that, we'll be really focusing on civil unrest, and then we will take a look at that communications outage. And just if you want to learn any more about emergency management and crisis communications, these ICS 42, 662, and 951, they are free. They're online, FEMA's website. If you are curious, I liked them a lot. I learned a heck of a lot. And that's just how we bridge the gap with crisis community communications and emergency management. So lastly, some new technology being considered here in the state of Indiana among some of our counties is Starlink, and using that as backup communications if there's a loss of the FirstNet Blackhawk. But we're also really diving into drone use for information sharing and status of critical infrastructure. Pre-incident, we can map stuff out, GIS map stuff out with our drones, and then overlay it with a current status. So if we're deployed to a natural hazard incident like an earthquake or a tornado, it will give us the ability to kind of quote see the buildings that were there maybe an hour ago that we don't see in front of us now, or they're severely damaged. We can't tell about foundation and where we should be going, where we shouldn't be going. Helps with search and rescue planning, resource requesting, information and intelligence sharing, all those other kinds of response activities. So, to wrap up, crisis communications, the maintained and sustained flow of voice and information sharing is the foundation of an all hazards emergency response structure. Everyone needs to know what's going on. We can't do a good job if we don't have good information. If we're not doing a good job, we're losing lives. It's critically important to all responders, public, co-workers, and all of our involved people that information is accurate and immediate. It can provide reassurance that response and recovery activities are truly underway. And I'll leave you with this thought. I had an instructor say that we, in emergency management response, regardless of sector, have three things to keep in mind. 1, we develop public trust. 2, we enable public confidence. And 3, we provide public hope. And I know it seems impossibly simple and maybe a little touchy-feely, but in disaster response, we are ultimately saving lives. And that is, of its own definition, a touchy-feely environment. People will be scared. People will be looking for families and will feel hopeless. Without sustainment of crisis communications, we fail in all three aspects, and failure is just not an option. And with that, I just wanted to say thank you for taking the time to talk crisis communications, learn about it. I very much so appreciate our time together, and thank you for your service in emergency management. And feel free to reach out if you have any questions or comments.
Thanks again to all our speakers. I think they've given us a lot to take with us today. You can learn more on this subject with our latest DRI workshop, Crisis Communication and Media Relations. This 2-day event covers everything you need to know to communicate effectively with the media via interactive presentations, case studies, open discussion, and more. And to help you gain comfort in front of the camera, one-on-one interviews and a mock press conference will be held and recorded for in-class review and reference. The first workshop, led by instructor Suzanne, one of our speakers today, will be held September 13th and 14th, and registration is open now. Follow the link on your screen for more information. Registration is also open for DRI 2022, our 10th conference designed for business continuity and resilience professionals. We'll be returning to the Planet Hollywood Resort and Casino February 13th through the 16th, 2022, and you can take advantage of early registration rates by using a code that you'll see on your screen when you sign up. We can't wait to see you there for our biggest event yet. If you still have questions that we didn't cover, give us a call at 866-542-3744. A recording of this and all our other webinars is posted on drii.org. I'm Russell Wooldridge, and this webinar has been a production of DRI International 2021, all rights reserved. Thank you for your attention.